Welcome and thanks for watching this video. Today, I want to spend 5 minutes talking to you about attributions. So this is a concept in social psychology that we use to try to help explain how people interpret each other's behavior. We'll also talk a little bit about the relationship between behaviors and people's attitudes as well. So that's kind of two-pronged goal over the course of about 5 minutes here. Attributions and attitudes. So I'm going to start with a definition of attributional theory. Whenever we watch someone else do something, whenever we watch a different person behave, one of our questions we initially ask, and you've probably felt this before, is why are they doing that? It's a common stand-up comedy trope too. I just thought of Sebastian Maniscalco. Why do people act the way they do? Well, we all do this all the time. We look for a cause for a behavior. So there are two different possible causes according to attribution theory. There is a dispositional attribution and a situational attribution. So a dispositional attribution is one in which we assume that, or we rather go with the hypothesis that the person is behaving the way they're behaving because of the way they are. It is part of their personal disposition. So you could maybe also call this an internal attribution. A situational attribution, by contrast, is one in which we hypothesize that the person's behaving the way they're behaving because of what's going on around them. So they're responding to the situation they're in. You could also call this an external attribution. And what we see happen very, very often out in the real world is something we call the fundamental attribution error, which is when somebody makes a hypothesis about somebody else's behavior that is dispositional in nature when the actual explanation for their behavior is situational. There are all kinds of examples of this. The easiest one to think of is probably traffic. So if you're out in traffic and somebody cuts you off, you go, "What a jerk. That person cut me off. How dare they? They must be an awful human being." That's a dispositional attribution. Their traffic behavior is a reflection of who they are as a human being. When actually, the real explanation for somebody's behavior in traffic is almost always situational, right? They're in a hurry, they're nervous to get somewhere on time, they're running late. Maybe their kids are screaming at them from the back seat and they're losing focus on their driving. Maybe they're playing an incredible song and they've lost track of where they are a little bit and they accidentally cut you off. And if they knew, they would feel really bad. There are at least a dozen situational attributions for that kind of traffic behavior, but we more often than not make a dispositional attribution and thus fall victim to the fundamental attribution error. There's other examples that we'll link to somehow in this video that include things like blaming the poor for their own misfortune and the unemployed for the fact that they're unemployed. This is a common fundamental attribution error, one unfortunately made up into the high levels of government in some cases, but the point is, if you come at a description of economic principles from a dispositional attributional standpoint, you will absolutely make that fundamental attribution error. People are not born to be rich or poor. It's something that happens because of what's going on around them. So that's another really common example of fundamental attribution errors. I usually call them FAEs here and there, and I don't know if anyone says that but me, but when I see it abbreviated, it feels natural. One other example of a fundamental attribution error that other folks can probably relate to is in school. When a child acts up in school, a teacher might fall prey to this fundamental attribution error if they were to make a dispositional attribution about the child's behavior rather than a situational attribution. Let's say a child is a little hostile one day. It would be probably inaccurate, especially if it's a single day, for a teacher to make a dispositional attribution and say something like, well, this child has an aggressive personality. This is just how they are, as opposed to they're reacting to some stress in their home. All these kinds of things are possible. We all make a lot of dispositional attributions about mental health in general when we could be making situational attributions. So that's another wide sweeping area where it's good to think about what kind of attributions we're making. So that is attribution theory. That's the idea that we look for causes for each other's behavior. Why is the person doing what they're doing? And the errors we tend to make along the way. Another concept that social psychologists use to think about how people interpret each other's behavior is the concept of attitudes. This was proposed originally by Leon Festinger. The idea is that we have these internal, typical kind of feelings that predispose us to respond in one particular way to an object or an event or a different person. So those are called attitudes, as Festinger originally wrote them out. The general concept here is that we have emotions or feelings or internal opinions about the world, and those manifest in attitudes. And those attitudes then turn into behavior once we're confronted with the person or event or object in question. On the other hand, sometimes behavior can shift our attitudes, our own behavior in certain cases, and sometimes other people's behavior around us. You have probably heard about getting your foot in the door. The foot in the door phenomenon is an idea that is primarily based on other people interpreting our attitudes. So this is the tendency for people who maybe would first agree to a small request would later on be more likely to comply with a larger request. So give me an interview would maybe is the first one, and then give me the job is maybe the second request. Rather, because behaviors can affect attitudes, because doing can sometimes become believing, you can get somebody to agree to something they might not have if you've already gotten them to comply with some smaller request. Another example of this is imposter syndrome. You've heard people for sure talk about moving up in their lives or getting into a new job and feeling like they don't quite belong there. The reason is because they have some previous attitude about themselves that doesn't match their current behavior. I've moved up, I'm managing people now, I feel like such an imposter. Or I got the big job I always wanted, but I feel like I don't deserve it. It's because all your previous behaviors and attitudes fit your previous roles. And now you're in a new role, your behavior doesn't match your attitude about yourself anymore. The nice thing about this is that, as I've been saying, sometimes behavior changes our attitudes. So as you behave, as you continue to be in the new role where you don't originally feel comfortable, your attitude will adjust. And usually we see those imposter syndrome kind of things fade in people. Those feelings tend to go away. A whole nother big area where attitudes are really heavily thought about in social psychology is another instance where behavior can affect an attitude, and that is the idea of cognitive dissonance. So cognitive dissonance theory is a pretty big deal in especially public perceptions of social psychology. It's a term that many folks have heard of, and there are a couple of relatively famous examples of cognitive dissonance. The one I think most have heard is the Ben Franklin example. So during the sort of Continental Congress era, there was another congressperson with whom Ben Franklin argued all the time. The guy hated him. They were sworn enemies, basically. And at some point during this process, Franklin said, "I'm tired of arguing with this dude every week. I have an idea." He wrote him a letter. He said, "Hey, I really always wanted to read this book," whatever book it was, "and I've heard that you have it. Is that true? Would you be willing to lend me the book so that I could read it?" And because the receiver was probably a kind Puritan gentleman, he complied and he sent him the book. And then suddenly, that man was filled with cognitive dissonance. "I hate Ben Franklin," was his attitude, but his behavior he had just done was loan Ben Franklin a book, and that those two things didn't match up. And the end result was, Franklin found that guy started to agree with him in Congress every now and then. So he reduced the negativity of that relationship by asking for that small favor. So there's a little foot in the door phenomenon probably there. Small request leads to compliance with a later larger request. But there's a lot of cognitive dissonance in this other congressman's feelings about Franklin. If I hated this guy, why would I lend him a book? I guess I don't hate him as much. So his attitudes adjusted to match his behaviors. There's a couple interesting other examples from research. Aronson and Carl Smith in 1963 published one of the first papers in this area, in which an experimenter left a child in a room and said, you can play with whatever you want in here, but you can't play with this one particular toy. They found that if they threatened the child with punishment for playing with the toy, the child avoided it, but still regarded it as desirable. I didn't play with it because I don't want to get punished, but man, I would still love to play with it. But if the experimenter left and just said, "I'll be disappointed if you play with this toy," instead of threatening punishment, the child avoided the toy and then also claimed that it wasn't a good toy, even weeks later. So the dissonance going on there is the child wasn't going to be punished for playing with the toy, but was going to kind of disappoint this experimenter who was more or less a stranger to them. So they didn't play with it, even though they would have liked to play with it. So their action, not playing with the toy, didn't match their attitude of wanting to play with the toy. So they adjusted the attitude to match the action. I didn't play with that toy, I must not like it so much. So there is kind of a common understanding of the world outside of the study of psychology, which is that you must change someone's attitude to change their behavior. And what I'm describing to you now, all these cognitive dissonance examples actually show that the opposite is also true. You can first change behavior to later change an attitude. It turns out there's more of a back and forth relationship between these two things than we would have originally thought back in the early 60s and before. So if you want to change someone else's behavior or change someone else's attitude, you could potentially go at it either way. So these two concepts, attributions and attitudes, fill in a lot of what we understand about how people interact with each other. In the attributional world, we are always trying to figure out why people behave the way they do. And in the attitude world, the attitude area of research, I should say, we know a lot these days about the relationships between what people feel and how people act, and the apparently back and forth, not exactly cyclical, but sort of feedback-based and feed-forward. We know a lot about what do we know a lot about? We know a lot about nothing, really. This is a secret. Psychology is a place where the science is it's like 120, maybe 140 or 50 years old, whereas physics is like thousands of years old. So we're really just getting started on a lot of this stuff. And people are way more variable than atoms. Anyway, the other side of this world that we just went through today is this attitude area of research, in which there is a lot we've learned about the relationship between how people feel and what they actually do. And it turns out that is a relationship that goes both ways. It's not just true that you have to change an attitude to change behavior. You can change behavior to change an attitude as well.